will say I enjoyed reading your short book from University of Minnesota Press. It's fiery and it's really focused on trying to create interesting, I think, bridges between movements on the left, and it tries to kind of theorize solidarity
Hmm.
in a way that I found like there's like revolutionary potential in the way that you theorize solidarity, um, because in some ways it's about like the question of how, given the ongoing nature of the genocide in Gaza and the shift of the world's focus in many ways away from the
Hmm.
ongoing kind of limbo that Palestinians are in,
Hmm.
neither peace nor war, neither I don't know. It's just it is a kind of liminal space, but unbelievably grim. And there, of course, has been a long history of boycott, divestment, and sanction as like a strategy for making, you could argue, Israel a pariah state, and sort of
Hmm.
trying to use tactics of shaming and divestment as a means of freeing up a space of possibility for Palestinian liberation. And your book Divest thinks about the BDS movement, but maybe not like explicitly. It's about the kind of
Hmm.
escalation of that movement into a kind of more radical, almost idea of divestment as a thing that you call a universal masochistic structure. I just felt like that was a big argument, and one that is, as you explain, rooted in psychoanalytic theory. So I thought, just to kind of get our bearings, we could start by exploring that idea of divestment as a universal masochistic structure. Um, Basically, like, what is the difference for you in your reading of Freud and the kind of inheritances of Freud between sadism and masochism? And can you tell us why you feel like it's useful for kind of expanding the divestment idea beyond just like specific campaigns?
Sure. First of all, thank you, and I'm glad that some these ideas were resonating with you as well. Maybe it would make sense for me to just provide a little context for how this book emerged, just for readers who maybe are less familiar with some of the events that really generated the kind of ideas that I'm exploring in this book. Because the book, for me, this is maybe my most personal book, and I sounds like from what you're saying that some of that energy came through in the writing, which I'm glad to hear. But it really the idea for this book, it kind of began in 2024 as I was witnessing the student protest movement for Palestinian freedom. And just to remind listeners, it was April 17th. We're coming up. We've just passed actually the 2-year anniversary mark of the April 17th 2024 Columbia University student encampments, also called, I actually like this term, I'm calling it a liberation zone. So students were erecting tents and engaging in various forms of mutual aid on their campuses, on the lawn of their university. And among other things, they were calling for a collective reckoning with the university's financial investments in the businesses profiting from Israel's genocide in Gaza. And as we may recall, in the days, weeks, months following the Columbia encampment, hundreds of other encampments sprung up at American colleges and universities internationally as well. All, I think inspired by and solidarity with the Columbia student encampment here in New York, where I live. Um, Encampments emerged at NYU, the New School, CUNY, where I work and teach. And I think, like many people, especially educators, but I think non-educators too, I was glued to these events. I was moved, genuinely inspired by what the students were doing, by their, I think, It's not an overstatement to say their bravery. And among the kind of chants and rallying cries that I was hearing on a daily basis, students were calling on administrators, specifically presidents, high-level administrators, presidents, boards of trustees, and so forth, to disclose and divest. And in other words, they were identifying what Francesca Albanese would later term an economy of genocide, and were highlighting higher ed's complicity in the capitalist genocide, which as we know, has been outrageously profitable for the weapons and technology manufacturers. And in the years following, up till now, students and faculty have been met with increased surveillance, disciplinary reprisals, legal action. Here at CUNY, there's the fight for, you may have heard of this, it's dubbed the CUNY Fired For. So adjunct faculty who were, I'll say inexplicably, in scare quotes, inexplicably fired, told that they wouldn't be returning to teach in the fall, I believe. And I think the only logical conclusion to reach from it is that they were fired because of their activism and because of their teaching the history of U.S. imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, and so forth. And so what I focus on in my book, it isn't the global economic structure of genocide and U.S. imperialism. There are many scholars who are far more knowledgeable than I am in those areas. Instead, my focus is on the psychic structures, as you were kind of underlining, that Freud identifies, specifically masochism and sadism. And I assert, boldly, that leftist emancipatory struggles are masochistic in their structure, and that rather than seeing that as a problem, or rather than seeing that as a hindrance to, I mean, it is, we can talk more about that. I think the way that Freud and Lacan think about masochism is precisely as an obstacle and a hindrance, but that's a bit more technical. Um, but rather than seeing it as a failure on the left, I'll put it that way. It's actually the way that I'm thinking about it via Freud, via Lacan, and other psychoanalytic thinkers, is actually as a vehicle for emancipatory struggles. And so I want to be clear that when I'm talking about masochism, I'm not using it in a pathologizing way or in a derogatory way whatsoever. For Freud, masochism, sadism, like terms like neurotic, these are just the structures that subjects fall into. It's just the kind for him, these it's like it's just what we are at our core. And uh, and so it's I'm not particularizing with this term, and it's and in part what the reason why I'm calling it a universal structure. One is because I'm trying to think about masochism as a form of leftist identification, you can say. Although I'm a little hesitant about that word identification because it seems too willed to voluntary, maybe. Whereas what I'm really talking about, and what Freud's talking about, is a kind of unconscious identification, if you will. Um, so I'm not trying to talk about particular groups as being masochistic or not masochistic. I kind of take Freud's idea on board and just say, okay, we are at our base masochistic beings. What do we do with that? It's sort of the basic question that I'm asking. What is to be done with that? And can it be a source uh, of mobilizing? The Can it be a way of mobilizing the left? And so what kind of interests me about what interests Freud and what interests me as well is how a masochistic structure persists or insists unconsciously through dreams and fantasies and also real world actions. And I think what's been interesting for me to think about is how subjects either embrace or reject that masochistic structure. And so my book kind of toggles between, okay, the kind of activist events unfolding in 2024 and afterwards, still to this day. psychoanalytic theory, some film criticism as well, and also pop culture examples, which I use to try and explicate, give some more texture to some of these ideas. Um, and you know, uh, as I was watching the events unfold in 2024, the student protest, I really did get the feeling that I was seeing psychoanalytic theory kind of come to life in front of my eyes. And the reason why this book is more of a personal book for me, by that I mean I feel like there's a little bit more me in the book. It's not as quote unquote scholarly in the sense we typically imagine a scholarly book being. Insofar as I have sort of some anecdotes and more personal reflection included in the book. The reason why I felt comfortable doing that is because part of this book was my attempt to try and understand the psychic, um, what I was experiencing as I was watching these events, as I felt helpless to intervene in these events, as I was kind of suffering with the students and others who were witnessing these events, involved in these events. I was trying to kind of find the language to grapple with all of that, and Freud's thinking around masochism was how I did that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that exact kind of self-reflection element of the book
Mm,
because just as what you're describing, so both this kind of like structure of our psyche that is both sort of immaterial and made manifest in our actions and our behaviors, our relationships,
mhm,
just as that is sort of, playing out in ways that are very visceral on campuses in this spontaneous but obviously organized way, you are
mhm,
also experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance or
mm,
internal struggle around feeling a level of identification with your students. You say that these
yeah,
encampments, the uprising for a free Palestine, sparked this intense compassion for the students. You even say in the book that you felt deeply that your students were being beaten, and that
right,
also is like a kind of riffing on Freud and these moments of analysis where he hears his patients saying like a child is being beaten in
mhm,
this disembodied way that they then eventually sort of identify themselves very intimately with, like it is in fact myself as a child being
yeah.
beaten. I wanted to really kind of zoom in on this feeling of compassion that you felt in the moment, which you're examining in the book. Like what you say is that your quote protectiveness of your students might have been misguided, and from the
Mm,
comfort of your home and Instagram feed, no less. So it's like
mhm,
mediated. And you say
mhm,
the truth is, I still don't know if I was right or wrong to say my students. So I kind of found that admission really bracing when I read it because it I like the intellectual humility in that, to me that's refreshing. I like that. And
Oh,
and it is
good. Thank you.
like it's because it's like it's subversively unscholarly to have that
Mm,
intellectual
mhm,
humility in a certain sense. And I wanted you to maybe speak to where that impulse came from. It just feels very honest, and why you wanted to make
mm,
sure that you were being self reflexive about your own potential kind of sentimentalism. Because what you specifically say about masochism is that it is more than just a kind of anodyne sentimentalism, right? Were you trying to kind of almost guard against a certain impulse there, or like what was going on in those pages?
good. Yeah. So I'm glad that those moments came across as refreshing or as inviting to you. That was my hope. But I felt as I was writing it and revising and reflecting, do I include this or don't I include this? I hesitated because it felt a bit uh, risky, as you say, like a little unscholarly, these kind of confessions of uncertainty. And but what I and there are a few moments like that. There's this anecdote that I provide of being in a Q&A and blurting out an answer on the question of freedom, and then and admitting that in the hours and the days and even years after that, my colleague who I was presenting with, we still kind of go back and forth on that question of freedom, how to think about it. And I think that in truth, these experiences of uncertainty are very common among academics, and yet we're our training, our institutions, everything kind of tells us that we're not allowed to inhabit those feelings and those experiences of doubt. So I was so the writing this book felt a little risky to me for a variety of reasons, but that being one of them, that I did want to inhabit those zones of well, I think one way to think about it, the reason why I decided it was right for this book was because I think that as I was writing it, I started to realize, oh my God, I'm in a way kind of enacting the very structure that I'm writing about in the book. That something felt a bit masochistic about exposing myself in these kind of, relatively small ways, but nonetheless. And and I think to me that is what makes masochism, the subtitle of my book is Political Masochism. So I'm trying to think about masochism again as a political formation or as having the potential to be a political formation. And uh, I think that with masochism, there's always this question of is this structure that Freud identifies, is it subversive? Is it emancipatory? Is it, you know, uh, um, serviceable on the left, you might say? Or and I ask that question because there's always the danger that it won't be, that uh, because it is unconscious, because it is often accessed through our dream life or in these kind of unwilled moments, um, we're never entirely sure how it's going to kind of foist itself on us or where it's going to take us. And so while I do think that there's a radical edge to what Freud says about masochism, and probably perhaps at some point in this conversation we should say a little bit more with more sort of technical precision what Freud says about masochism, but I think it's kind of fascinating because so much of the kind of like the scholarship, so much of the discourse on the left within activist circles, within scholarship, I think is too wedded to the idea that if we just know more, then we will act accordingly. And I think that there's a reason why to this day it's very hard for thinkers on the left to integrate Freud, and it's because Freud does not allow you to have that certainty. Or in other words, Freud doesn't allow you to believe that more knowledge will result in better actions or a better future. Uh, I think that there are radical ways in which masochism can be expressed, and the student movement I posit, is one of those examples. But of course, you could say that our masochism is also in some ways what keeps us tied to structures that oppress us, right? And it's so one of the things that I'm trying to think about is in this book is how can we articulate, enact, even become cognizant of this sort of masochism so that it can start to inform our actions, shape our theory differently so that we are less beholden to a um, it's for all of the theory of the 20th and 21st century that is sort of anti kind of the Enlightenment subject, the kind of transparent, rational subject. I think it's surprising how much of it is still beholden to that model, for the reasons that I was just saying, that it tends to rely on a subject that isn't undermining itself. And so what Freud means by masochism is basically that we derive enjoyment from undermining ourselves, and we do it in big and small ways all the time. And so again, the question is what do you do with that? If you take that on board, Freud's theory, if you take that on board, then what do you do with it? And so some of my hedging and qualification that you're identifying in the book about sentimentalism, I was saying before that I'm a little hesitant around the word identification because it seems too willed, has to do with my reservations around I don't want um, divestment or masochism in the way that I'm theorizing in this book to be construed as if we just felt more in a kind of affect theory way, or if we just kind of if we recognized the other and their suffering more, then we will behave differently. While that might be true in some cases, I think that there's a rather persuasive history and scholarship around all the failures of that kind of sentimental thinking. So again, what I'm trying to point to is something that is unwilled, that is there as a structure, whether we want it to be or not, and that can actually surprise us, can feel dangerous at times, and catch us off guard. And so I think part of what I was in these self-reflexive moments experiencing and writing about and incorporating into my kind of theorizing in this book are those moments where I felt like something unwilled is happening, even as I am trying to make sense of Freud's theory and the events that are kind of unfolding around me.
Wow, yeah, that's like insightful but really challenging, and I see it like I
Uh-huh.
see it so as so connected to the challenging ideas that you have in Divest about the value of belonging as such, right? Like this is
Mm-hmm,
such an
mm-hmm.
important kind of turn at the end of the book. It's almost like you're presenting belonging as in tension with this other thing, this kind of self undermining, masochistic, and solidaristic, but only potentially solidaristic thing, which is always, I mean, it might be strategic, it might be contingent, but it's not like it's stable and just like all ready to hand, like just always there. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe before we dive into this question of belonging versus what you call non-belonging, it might
Mm-hmm.
be worth like just you know naming the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is Donald Trump, right? Like this big
Mm-hmm.
orange menace that represents for so many people a kind
Yeah.
of fascistic, unabashed joy in belonging to the MAGA movement, right? This sort of like
Yeah.
monolithic kind of, thing. The way that it feels to me like Trump signifies a war on woke, for example,
Mm-hmm.
it's just really kind of, it seems crucial for understanding this like political conjuncture, this like tipping point that we're at. And I talked about this with a past guest, Dominic Boyer, who made the
Mm-hmm.
point that like there's a kind of symbolic shamelessness that Trump lets people pour themselves into, right? He's like
Mm-hmm.
he is that president for folks. And I wonder if this is why you write in the book that Trump uses their enjoyment to his advantage. You say for them, Trump is the president of enjoyment. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter if he's honest or corrupt or even intent on destroying them because he allows them to kind of pour this uncomplicated, maybe even sadistic pleasure into a figure, right? That they can rally around, that they can wear t-shirts and sport flags for. And, like there's just for me so much in that analysis of Trump. And I think a lot of us have analysis fatigue around Trump, but there's
Sure.
something exciting about the potential of this argument that, isn't just about shaming and blaming and displacing and objectifying the MAGA folks, but actually trying to understand like what it is about Trump that is actually deeply appealing as well, you know?
Totally.
So
Yeah.
could you kind of like unpack that idea that Trump for these folks is actually the president of enjoyment?
Sure. Yeah. Right. So one of the ways that I think about what the one is one of the ways I talk about Trump in this way. I mean, I do think that it's probably right to say that Trump is the kind of great figure of sadistic politics, but that the way that that operates is through, I think, for his supporters, a kind of a masochistic identification that in other words, yeah, precisely. And I think the way that you framed this just now actually points out to my mind one of the problems with ideas of belonging in the many ways that that idea as a kind of catch-all term gets mobilized both on the right and the left. That at a certain point, this term belonging gets it becomes problematic to me because it can so easily be mobilized on either side. So that suggests to me that there has to be some sort of that we need to be pretty critical of it and not just take it for granted. But if you're a Trump supporter, I think you're a Trump supporter because Trump gives you a sense of belonging, and that the way that the and allows you to enjoy. In other words, I think it's misguided to interpret the Trump phenomenon, the right-wing phenomenon, the kind of neo-fascism and so forth, purely in terms of power and, as we were saying before, a kind of lack of knowledge on the part of Trump supporters. Like time and again, I hear liberals and even leftists saying like, don't they know better? So some version of something like that. And I guess I just want to say that at a certain point, I mean, maybe not, but in many cases, probably. But also, I just want to say, at a certain point, at a certain level, it doesn't matter because it's really the enjoyment that Trump allows them to have, and it's always enjoyment through very petty things, typically like yes, bashing woke liberals and so forth, or in more extreme cases, of course. And I think this is where Trump's sadism is manifest. One of the things I try to articulate with some precision in the book is how does he enable his supporters to enjoy? And I think that while he gives them a sense of belonging, yes, so they belong within a kind of white supremacist, kind of mythological American, in some cases hyper-masculinist culture. I think the real source of the enjoyment is the exclusion that Trump offers as well. So you can identify with me, belong to this kind of um, community. Um, but the way that that is formed is always through some form of exclusion, whether it's the exclusion of this kind of fantasy of the woke liberal or the radical professors or trans people or immigrants and so forth. And so I think that while they are able to enjoy through Trump, it's always sort of a secondhand enjoyment. I think that it's first there has to be some lack. So I'm using lack in a kind of Lacanian sense. There has to be someone has to be excluded. There has to be some threat posited. So the immigrants wants to take your job. The trans people want to take your bathrooms. The radical professors. If only more of those radical professors actually existed. The radical professors want to, like convert your children to the kind of like leftist cause, etc. Um, I think it's through that positing of a threat or of a imminent lack that they're able to enjoy masochistically without having to be conscious of the fact that they are enjoying masochistically, right? So they kind of Trump is so powerful because he taps into what I'm calling that universal masochistic structure, and Trump supporters are tapping into that again unconsciously, tapping into that masochistic structure. I think it's plain to see that those who support Trump stand to lose far more than they gain. And now we're all in it with them. We're all losing. So some far more than others as a result of Trump 2.0. And yet they're able to again enjoy secondhand through the cover of this identification or through the cover of this sense of belonging, like now I am finally seen by someone, right? I think that's what Trump gives them, far more than any of the kind of like talking points that people tend to come back to, of, etc.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been learning a lot from studies of kind of Christian nationalism as really like
Hmm.
a central place that has allowed Trump's ascent, right? There's documentaries and books now that are kind of coming out that show that I think the trap that American politics in particular are in is really defined by like a Christian nationalism, an ethno-nationalism, and Trump is the sort of iconic figure of that. And you're actually saying in the book that that kind of nationalism, which it's not exclusive to the United States. It's a kind of Judeo-Christian nationalism. If we're talking about the U.S.-Israeli kind of
Sure.
alliance, you
Hmm.
say, yeah, to quote the book, U.S. Israeli nationalism alongside state repression of Jewish, multi faith, and secular dissent does not protect Jewish people. Such repression only harms them. So I think like
Hmm.
that reminder that they also stand to lose is valuable because then the book also is like operating not just as a rallying cry for the left, it is explicitly and vociferously that. But it's also an attempt, I think, to bring other folks along, to say to folks
Yeah.
that are like ensnared by this masochistic structure in the Trumpian sense, like, you know, you also stand aloof, lose. Folks telling
Hmm.
you that January 6th was a love fest or that these racist rallies are all about love, they're lying to you. They have their own interests
Yeah.
at heart, and they're mobilized by
Yeah.
those interests. So I think like that is really interesting to me. And when I read the book, or when I was reading the book, I was really thinking a lot about its relationship to affect theory, which you mentioned
Mm.
earlier. One of the things Sarah Ahmed, the sort of, I'll call her the progenitor of the kind of modern version of affect theory. One of the things she says is that love is a sort of a form of violence in a sense.
Mm.
Like
Hmm. Hmm.
Ahmed is writing about this myopic sort of love, like a self love that is so often about protecting privilege. The way she describes it is that it is not only about looking for, but it's about sort of summoning and requiring the obstacle to kind of secure your sense of self and your privilege, right?
Hmm.
Your sense of belonging in the world really requires this obstacle. And to me, this is really related to your critique of inclusion, right? She, of course, Ahmed has written multiple books on the pitfalls of this discourse around inclusion, institutional inclusion. Like these are ideas that are really fraught for both of you, and I
Hmm.
wonder, why it feels like for me like you both see radical potential in kind of a reclaiming of a certain kind of like non-belonging and antagonism toward that myopic sort of love, right? Specifically, you're saying like,
Yeah.
there's real value in recognizing those ideas of love as quite exclusionary, quite objectifying. So I just wondered if you could maybe um, riff on that to some extent, the relationship between maybe your work and these influential pieces of affect theory, and maybe in particular, like how the book might be used to rethink, yeah, the kind of fascistic invocation and exploitation of the language of love here.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, so first, I just want to give credit where credit's due. On these terms, belonging and non-belonging, that we've been using, and that I use in my book too. Um, the source for me for thinking this way is really Todd McGowan, who's a film theorist, psychoanalytic theorist, who's written um, about these ideas in a variety of ways. I think this idea of belonging, non-belonging, are sort of his latest articulation of this. I think it's fair to say this Lacanian idea, which actually I'll connect back to love. Um, I guess maybe I'm a bit of a romantic. I want to hold on to some notion of love as radical. Although I totally get what you're saying and what Sarah Ahmed's saying too. That again, it's too bad that Trump is such a convenient example for so many of the ills of our contemporary world. But he kind of embodies them. So, but Trump, I was about to say loves. Trump enjoys. I'll say that Trump enjoys saying. He uses the word love quite a bit, like, "Oh, my supporters love me. I love you," right? So he's really done a disservice to the word love, I think, in our language. And in our just cultural life. Um, and for the reasons that I think Ahmed is pointing to, that when you think of love in terms of, I guess I would use the word cohesion or even fusion around a an identity, um, then I mean, to me, as someone who's sort of steeped in psychoanalysis, I think I'm always very suspicious of identity, and whether it's a kind of a group identity, a collective identity, or an individual identity. And I think one really simple way of thinking about my opposition to belonging, which is not to say that, people shouldn't come together around a shared cause, or that people shouldn't come together around to talk about books together on Zoom and make these sorts of things. But I'm always interested in what is, as someone, again, as a sort of psychoanalytic thinker, what is the immaterial, or the, Lacan uses this term, inexistent, this thing that is there but not there. So this absent presence. What is this thing that is absent within the collective, or even absent within the psyche, that is causing that, or yeah, causing that collective formation, or bringing people together. I think that we typically think of love or collective organizing as around very explicit goals and objectives. But I think from a Freudian Lacanian perspective, that it's actually, I mean, this goes back to the idea of masochism, that it's I think actually experiences of absence, or lack, or even disunity, particularly the disunity of the self. I mean, at a very basic level, this is what Freud is getting at when he talks about the unconscious, is that we never get to be our identities. Right? We're always sort of beside ourselves. We're always fractured. We're always split. Again, from a kind of psychoanalytic perspective. And um, so we cannot belong to a greater whole, because, first of all, we don't belong to ourselves. I think that's the kind of baseline psychoanalytic idea. It's why Freud was not very outspoken on political issues. I mean, he had his moments when he did. He was critical of Marxism and so forth. And Lacan was even worse. Lacan was basically a conservative. And yet there's something interesting there, because even against their kind of express political views, their theories are quite radical, I think, or have the potential to be quite radical, including what they say about love. Freud has some very interesting things to say about love. He calls it a kind of universal form of debasement. um, and Lacan has a couple of aphorisms they're, these kind of pithy sayings that I quite like. He says, "I love in you something more than you," and that "in you more than you" is, I think, what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about this absent presence within a collective formation, or within collective organizing, or thinking about the student protests. Of course, there are the explicit aims, which they quite clearly, enumerated to their university administrators. We want you to do XYZ, divest, disclose. Um, but then there's this unspoken thing that I'm calling masochism, or that we might just call kind of enjoyment. That is, I think, part of the galvanizing force there. Um, and so I think that there is something to this notion of love that maybe goes beyond what Ahmed is critiquing as this kind of and maybe Ahmed would be on board with this kind of what I'm saying, that it kind of goes beyond this sort of normative, conservative deployment of love as just kind of a fusional thing. Um,
Hmm.
and in fact, this language of love, like, Freud is the terms that I think folks who are not too familiar with Freud, they often use this language of there's eros and there's thanatos, so love and death. And I'm not quite sure that Freud ever actually uses those. He uses the term eros um, as this kind of like psychic binding operation. I'm not sure that he ever uses thanatos, but of course, what he means by eros is it's this kind of contradictory thing where it's both what he calls pleasure principle, or this drive to kind of release tension or release excitement or to experience what he calls pleasure. And but bound up in that is this kind of flip side, this thing that he calls the death drive too, that is this operation of splitting, of loss, of undermining, and so forth. And I think, the essay that I engage with in Divest, A Child is Being Beaten, was published the year before, or maybe the same year as his kind of breakthrough essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I think that what he goes on to call the death drive, he is calling masochism in the previous essay.
There's a ton there, and I really want to maybe pick up on this idea that I hadn't heard before. This Lacanian aphorism: "I love in you something more than
Then
you."
you, yeah.
It immediately reminded me of this moment in the Derrida documentary, right, where
Mm-hmm.
Jacques Derrida, this esteemed French philosopher, is asked an impossibly vague question about like what is love. He's like, I have no idea. you know, he's like,
Mm-hmm.
you need to define what you mean, and then they kind of, the interviewer kind of can't, and Derrida, being the incredibly generative philosopher that he always was, is able to sort of vamp in the moment. And he says,
Sure.
like, what we can perhaps say is that it's love is about the qui or the quoi. It's about the who or the what.
Uh,
You can either love the who or the what. And to me, like that's sort of interesting to think about in relationship to movements.
mm,
My friend Sarah Stein Lebrano is writing a lot about social trust and social cohesion right now, and she's an organizer as well, and she's really interested in like how you create less transactional sort of bridges between people. Right? She's interested in just
mm-hmm.
like relationships between neighbors, for example, that
Yeah.
are indeterminate. And it is in some ways about the who or the what. It's like, do I love what you can provide me, what you are for me, or do I
Right.
love the kind of the who,
Hmm.
the you in your otherness, let's say crudely, right?
Yeah.
When I picture these liberation zones, these encampments, there is a
Yeah.
kind of love being fomented in these
Oh, sure.
spaces, right?
Yeah.
And your book is suggesting that those moments of a kind of radical love erupting on campuses revealed also a great deal about the capitalist world order, the kind of violence of the capitalist world order,
Hmm.
and also the kind of like callousness of the university that was a home to these folks, and that pitches itself as like a really transformative space of
Hmm.
self-exploration and all these things. You're writing that this was, just descriptively, the biggest student protest since the 1960s. So before April 17th, 2024, global solidarity with Palestine on this scale was unthinkable. After the event of April 17th, it became unstoppable. If we want to think about love as a more kind of radical or expansive kind of love, it makes sense to maybe dwell with this idea that like it really was a kind of local and global kind of cosmopolitan eruption of potential in these spaces. And yet, my fear is that despite the documentaries, despite the books, despite reflections, will somehow be forgotten. Those like spaces of possibility will not be remembered. And the
Sure.
fear comes from the sense that like the crackdown was successful, like that this unstoppable movement was actually, halted in some ways by this very like active, dynamic and integrated, campaign of censorship and punishment.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you write that it became unstoppable, is it for you more about like the psychic unstoppable or the political unstoppable? And can we separate the two?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this is more just like a biographical information. I wrote the book in, I think I say in the preface, fall of 2024. And at that time, it felt both ways, both politically on the ground, but also psychically in this way that we've been talking about, this kind of spreading enjoyment, spreading kind of love, that those felt to me unstoppable. And it was part of the reason why I wanted to write the book, is because I wanted to seize on that momentum, that energy, and to, I think, maybe idealistically, I wanted to articulate to the best of my ability what I saw going on, so that there might be some additional longevity to this movement, albeit in writing, but nonetheless. Um, and I think it's really, and this is true of all recent, maybe all protest movements, like what the aftermath will be. We're 2 years out now, and something that, to my mind, felt absolutely radical, potentially revolutionary happening, and reaching a kind of, not just, it wasn't, I joke in the book, it wasn't just an Ivy League dust up. I think that's the way that conservatives were kind of describing it, dismissing it, but it was a global student solidarity movement. And I think we'll see. Just a few days ago, there was a protest among NYU, CUNY, and probably students from other New York universities that were renewing the call to divest at their universities, and also commemorating the movement from 2 years ago. And so I think that it still flares up, but I I hear you, and I lament to a certain extent that it seems like some of the fire has burnt out. And it's because, as you say, of the coordinated repression. Um, and I think among my colleagues and among academics, this real chilling effect that took place of where I think in some ways it felt masochistic to, if you are someone concerned with your professional livelihood, to speak out on these particular issues. And of course, I when I wrote this book, I was a tenured academic, so I had some protections. But these days, with the attacks on higher ed, nothing is a guarantee. And so, in honesty, I don't know what the longevity of this movement will be, but I tend to think, I had a moment during the ICE raids in Minneapolis and the mutual aid organization and pushback, the really kind of inspiring community organizing that was happening there, that again sprung up. They're kind of repeated across different cities, Los Angeles, New York, elsewhere. And these are just the cities that get the most attention. But, it was happening again nationally. And I was seeing echoes Whether there were on the ground connections between these things or not, I don't know, but echoes in terms of the way that this resistance was mobilizing, the language that was being used, and so forth. So I like to think that that this will continue to spread uh, in different ways in different sites of contestation. And I cite the philosopher Alain Badiou quite a bit in this book because I do find someone who writes quite a bit on love, actually, and because I find he's not he is a revolutionary thinker. That is to say, and maybe this is in part kind of a weakness of his thinking, but he is one of those rare voices where he's really trying to champion a revolutionary politics. And but he says that all events are fragile and precarious, and that it's only in the kind of repetition. Here's where I pick up on a kind of psychoanalytic language in Badiou. It's only the repetition of the event that prolongs it. And so, in my own small way, I'm trying to create kind of a repetition of these events and to try and frame them so that they might persist. Um, but you had
Yeah.
a nice articulation of is this is this political, is this insistence or this unstoppableness? Is it political or is it psychic? And I want to say that I don't want to separate those two things. There's this old feminist saying that the personal is political, but I guess I want to add to that I think the political is always psychic. So in other words, it's not a for me, and this is sometimes the I think the divide between, let's say, psychoanalysis and Marxism or other leftist traditions of how do you scale up a psychoanalytic politics beyond the clinic or beyond the individual to think about social formations, like a macro scale. And I guess I want to say that I think that masochistic structure that Freud's identifying that's always there. It's always there in the social. It's always there on the streets, and that the challenge is to try and bring it out, or the challenge is to try and recognize it, so that we can hopefully articulate more better, smarter, and more lasting forms of resistance.
Yeah, I think that's really remarkable, and that there's almost too much to unpack. But what I want to say is that for me, it's itself kind of too enticing to imagine any particular event as a kind of point of no return. I take Bedou's
Mhm.
point that it really, you have to remember, repeat, renew the kind of the kernel of something, you know, that flourishing that takes place,
Mhm.
right? In
Mhm.
order for it to be lasting, there's just no guarantees. As Stuart Hall reminded us
Mhm. Mhm.
back at the kind of inception of cultural studies, like politics is always this contingent thing,
Mhm.
and what you're up against is able to evolve as well. Like the evolution of Zionist strategies for, suppressing and repressing dissent is itself, worth really reckoning with and understanding. Like, if we want to think about, where the struggle for Palestine's freedom is at, I mean, we really do need to confront the fact that charges of anti-Semitism, which have been routinely used since and before October 7th,
Yeah.
are like very effective
Oh yeah.
in making criticism of Israel's genocidal policies unthinkable, unsayable.
Sure.
Like, and I think, like, and for me, it's like so much of the frustration comes from the fact that, okay, so like, not only is opposition to Zionism completely distinct from anti-Jewish racism, it
Mhm.
is itself an anti-racist position, right? Being
Mhm. Mhm.
anti-Zionism is
Yeah.
means actually being anti-racist. And
Yeah.
that's what's so unbelievably frustrating about the tactic. It attacks anti-racists for their alleged racism in defense
Mhm.
of a regime that is predicated on racial domination.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just wonder if thinking in more critical ways about these like circuits of compassion and empathy and identification can almost like help us out of this trap, this hasbara kind of propagandist tactic of labeling and libeling all forms of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism.
Mm.
And if you want to kind of expand on what you're saying in the book about that that kind of tactic in light of what we've been discussing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I call it a kind of an extreme form of sophistry that we're experiencing now, where which is why I find it which is why I found it so crushing, really, to witness firsthand the university responses, the backlash, the repression, the outright force used against students who were the only at that time and perhaps still the only truth sayers, it seemed, on campuses. In other words, the ones able and willing to make the clear distinctions that you're just making now, that actually these two things are not the same. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and so forth. But the of course, as you say, it's highly effective rhetoric, highly effective language, and Title VI is being weaponized to kind of silence anti-Zionist argument, protest, and these sorts of things. And so um, it's really hard to know really how to counter that, and how to counter at a certain level what you might just say is again, going back to um, this term, the economy of genocide, just the sheer um, economic, financial weight behind the opposition, the kind of conservative opposition, right? That being said, I think that I do try to really kind of, at least especially in the kind of opening chapter of this book, drill into the sort of terminology, for example, thinking about what Freud means by masochism, how he identifies it, and also thinking about what I find so fascinating about Freud's essay, "A Child is Being Beaten," is that these two things, sadism, masochism, although I think it's frightening to see them play out so clearly today, but they're actually kind of entangled the way that Freud is thinking about it, that the dreams, the fantasies that he's encountering in his analyses in the clinic, um, they often begin with this sort of passive construction where it's not clear yet as the dreamer whether you're occupying a masochistic position or a sadistic position. And it's only through this kind of analytic work that Freud is able to come around to seeing that sometimes these spatial metaphors are dubious, but it's hard to get around them. But at the sort of like basement level, at this sort of primal level of our unconscious, is that the person witnessing the abuse is also receiving the abuse. That in fact the person witnessing is in the picture, in the scene that they're daydreaming about, and are indeed the one. They're daydreaming about their own harm. Yeah. And so um, I try to think about these terms, and I as a way of, actually want to go back to something you mentioned before, and I kind of failed to highlight it, that in this book it's not a screed against Trump supporters or conservatives, or what have you. I mean, I think it's relatively obvious the problems there. If anything, I'm more vociferous and critical of liberals. By that I mean like Democrats and some leftists too. In part because I think that insofar as my argument is really kind of constructed around ideas of enjoyment, I think that one of the real problems today and why we are, at least in, at the kind of the broad scale, mainstream scale, that why there's so little real pushback um, against the kind of conservative distorting of language and, beyond the kind of obvious financial pressures and so forth, is that the liberals and to a certain extent leftists don't really, it's not clear that they are explicitly offering a form of enjoyment that is distinct from their conservative foes. Like, again, to go back to Trump as this sort of symbol of enjoyment, does does the Democratic Party have a symbol of enjoyment? There's Bernie. I think that's maybe the closest we've had in some years. Yeah, and Mamdani here in New York City, I think was able to tap into some of that as well. So there's flickers of it, but of course, what do the Democrats do? They squash it. Anytime there's any kind of like populist enjoyment around a progressive figure, they squash it. And what they do instead is engage in a kind of shaming or vilifying rhetoric, or this kind of, you know, the famous Hillary Clinton line, the basket of deplorables, that sort of rhetoric to talk about um, the far right and their supporters. And I guess to me, one of the more, I think, radical things about Freud's notion, and why I really want to make a case for a kind of universalist thinking, is that when we're talking about a structure of enjoyment, we're not talking about like I have my enjoyment, you have your enjoyment, conservatives have their enjoyment, and so forth. The structure is the same. In Freud's thinking, the structure is the same for all. And so the real challenge is to uh, figure out a way to mobilize people around that form of enjoyment, less so to um, separate people into different kinds of camps and so forth. And so that's where I think some of the kind of terminological investigation here is important.
Yeah, I see a lot of value in it. I think that last point, or one of the last points you made there about the Democratic Party in the United States, and I mean, like, the Liberal Party in Canada is no different. I mean, this has
Hmm.
basically been the
Hmm.
ruling party of Canada since the country's inception, right?
Hmm.
It's been about divestment from division in some sense. Like when Justin Trudeau was elected, he invoked this language of sunny ways and sort of a kind of mollifying of antagonism as this kind of new model. And the actions of his government suggested the exact opposite, right? Which was
Sure.
about ramping up and accelerating extractivism and a despoliation of indigenous lands. And so I
Sure. Yeah.
mean, like, that's interesting in relationship to the kind of distancing of oneself from enjoyment that sometimes folks on the kind of, I think in particular, like that kind of professionalized left, I guess we could say, right?
Mm.
The professional managerial class on
Yeah.
the left is invested in, because it's like it's too risky. It's too risky to lean into a kind of left populism, even if it works, because
Mm.
your electability among folks that you perhaps identify more with in your own psyche goes down. And that, I mean, like the kind of cognitive dissonance that must cause in folks that are like professional politicians, I'm sure is very real. But what you're saying in the book, and this is the last sort of question I'll ask, just because you've been already so generous with your time, is that there's basically no other choice in your argument for leftists, for folks that actually believe in a radical future after, this kind of neoliberal model of a race to the bottom form of capitalism. Like, there's no choice but the choice of division. You say the earth will be engulfed in flames, the ocean smeared with oil, species reduced to mono nature, governments gutted by corporations, schools turned into automated delivery systems. I mean, if nothing stands in the way of something like artificial intelligence, then we can already kind of perceive the contours of what that future will be, right? And so against
Sure, yeah, I
that,
don't think it's really the future anymore. I think
that's
everything
right.
I say there is more or less, it's unfolding.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
materializing. And so,
yeah.
my question would be, how you can maybe give us a sense of how, like, division is vital for as a force that opposes what you call maintenance. Like you say, the U.S. state is focused now exclusively on what you describe as maintenance, maintenance of the idea that this is it, that there can be no other way of things, no other world, but the world as we know it. Basically, like, would you suggest that, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that division is potentially vital for undoing that kind of ideology of maintenance that folks like Trump obviously really represent in this moment?
I think so, and I think this is really where my commitment to psychoanalysis, not only as a kind of clinical practice, but as a theory, a philosophy, uh, and as a way of thinking about and articulating political action. It's really where it really comes to the fore. And um, you know, I think that some of the opposition that I get sometimes really comes down to a kind of allergy to this notion of division, which by which I don't mean a kind of opposition between different identities. I think if anything that we are in the hellscape we're in now in large part because of a kind of monadic way of thinking about our world and society, that we're all just sort of different particular identities competing for resources. I mean, I think that that is the kind of the capitalist game that we're forced to play, but but rather what Freud would call psychic division. I think that, and rather than seeing that as in somehow as a I said at the start of our conversation that there's something that we need to be actually kind of precise about thinking about what the obstacle means in psychoanalysis. And I think another way of thinking about masochism or masochistic enjoyment or psychic division, all these kinds of terms that when you're in psychoanalytic circles, people throw out all the time. But I think another way of thinking about that is learning to live with certain obstacles, right? And the thing that I'm really identifying in this book is saying, look, if we have all bought into this idea that the way to collectivize, the way to make a better world is to imagine various forms of wholeness, whether a kind of an integrated self or an integrated community and so forth, then I think we have a real problem because I'm just I don't think that that exists really. I guess I've drunk the psychoanalytic Kool-Aid, and so from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's actually the symptom or the thing that kind of bedevils us, right? Uh, at a very basic level, okay, I do all sorts of things that undermine myself, like writing, for example. I think is one of the ways that I access my drive. It's like on the one hand, yes, I write so that I can have all these kinds of fun conversations with people like you and get ideas out in the world. But as any writer knows, it's actually kind of a laborious undertaking. It involves a lot of social isolation. Always feel like a failure when you're a writer and so forth. So there is a kind of masochistic undercurrent to this. And I think, what Freud and Lacan would say is that the obstacle to social cohesion, the obstacle to happiness or a harmonious existence, these sorts of things, can also be the impetus for radical social change and transformation. That it's the obstacle that urges us on as desiring beings, right? And the challenge is, I think, going forward to recognize that we are not kind of siloed or little monads enjoying or encountering our obstacles, whether it be work or whether it be something more personal, whatever our individual symptoms are, but that there's actually a universal component to it, and that thinking about these forms of division as integral to relationality, integral to social formation, mobilizing, organizing, so forth. It is counterintuitive, I understand. It is hard at times to wrap your head around. And yet, one of the reasons why I'm drawn to the student protest movement as an example, as a springboard for this book, is because every so often you see examples of it happening on the street. Not willed, not intentionally. I don't think that students were running around with copies of Freud at their protests, although you never know. That would be great. Maybe Fanon, maybe Franz Fanon. But every so often you see this, going back to that idea of love, the in you more than you happening, and generating something, producing something from that absence or that lack or that rift. And I think too often we on the left want to overcome the obstacle, heal the rift, mend everything, and I think that is actually a dead end. So that's what I'm kind of getting at polemically when I say it's masochism or bust at the at the end of the book.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, and I resonate with the wrestling that you're doing, right? Like the fact that you're wrestling against this myth of a certain wholeness, and saying that, like, if we want to, for example, deal with in earnest the feelings that people have around it being sort of too late almost to fight, to continue fighting, like that it's too far gone in various ways. Think about the environmental crisis alone.
Sure.
And that kind of fatalism, which can be fatal. Like, if we want to actually confront it, we can't simply pose like hope or simplistic values of like belonging as like the alternative. I think you have to try and, when we talk about meeting people where they are, we so often invoke it in this like just as a reflex almost, right? Without thinking about what that means or trying to understand it, like the actual kind of rift that exists within where people are, and that they are at different places at different points in time. So I think your book is like an interesting compass for navigating those kinds of dynamics. So I appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you talking to me about it, and I'm glad it's out in the world.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.